The question of what happens to old Starfleet uniforms has finally been answered in Star Trek: Lower Decks. Star Trek's changing uniforms started early. Star Trek, the original series' color-coded uniforms were replaced by muted unitards in Star Trek, the motion picture, and Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan's long-lived monster maroon. As a prequel series, Star Trek Enterprise introduced a blue jumpsuit grounded in modern flight suits. Star Trek Discovery bridged the Star Trek timeline uniform gap with a sleek blue two-piece that quickly evolved into Star Trek Strange New World. Take on two's classic uniforms. In Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5, Episode 5, Starbase 80, the USS Cerritos is forced to make a stop at the infamously terrible Starbase to get a replacement navigation part. El-Orient Commander Cassia Inox, Nicole Byer, explains that Starbase 80 operates on a mishmash of outdated technology from around the 2260s because the station isn't a high priority for Starfleet. The result is that Star Trek Lower Decks' basket of Easter eggs for Starbase 80 is curated from Star Trek, the original series, or even Star Trek Enterprise. 100 years before that, Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5, Episode 5, Starbase 80, reveals what happens to old Starfleet uniforms when Lieutenant Devana Tendi, Noel Wells, stops to admire a clothing shop stocked with outfits from Star Trek history. There are a few non-Starfleet gems, like a 2260s Klingon uniform and an Edda onesie from Star Trek: The Next Generation, but most of the shop's offerings represent the ever-changing uniforms of Starfleet's past. The store clerk flatly informs Tendi that these are the uniforms of long-dead men. The phaser burns and a pile of TOS-era red shirts pretty much confirm that claim. In the 24th century, old Starfleet uniforms would normally be recycled by the replicator, but Starbase 80 doesn't have replicators. At best, Starbase 80 might have a 23rd century matter synthesizer that makes uniforms, as seen in Star Trek Discovery, but the station's general state of disrepair means those probably don't work that well, if at all. It's a lot easier for the residents of Starbase 80 to make do with what they've been able to repair or scavenge. It's not that grim to strip the uniforms off dead officers and reuse them for new staff, is it? With Starbase 80, Star Trek Lower Decks creates a brilliant throwback to Star Trek Enterprise and Star Trek, the original series, without the perils of time travel in Star Trek. The USS Cerritos crew has to use Enterprise's theoretically sexy but ultimately dodgy decon gel before boarding. Jerry O'Connell's commander Jack Ransom is a big fan. TOS-era wall comms replace comm badges, and the turbolifts have twist handles. It's a great way to give the Star Trek Lower Decks treatment to an era that's been tricky to honor, aside from name-dropping Scott Bakula's Captain Jonathan Archer or Denobulan Tourist. Star Trek Lower Decks is great at celebrating the beauty of weird and obscure stuff that Star Trek has wrought throughout its history. The often maligned Starbase 80 being a functioning time capsule of antique technology makes it the Starbase equivalent of Star Trek Enterprise. Commander Inox and Chief Engineer Gene Yukubovsky, Stephen Root, can choose from multiple styles of Starfleet uniforms worn by dead officers, but they deliberately choose to don 2150 Starfleet uniforms. Wearing Enterprise-era uniforms while cheerily championing Starbase 80 is like Star Trek Lower Decks saying Star Trek Enterprise isn't nearly as long dead as it seems.